Welcome to the Passing Through Podcast, a show dedicated to exploring those spaces not just within, but also between and around us. The cracks in the walls, the moments between the moments, the silence that stitches a song together. This isn't a podcast about answers or about fixing the world. It's a space for listening, for slowing down and sitting in the unknown to see what might surface in the stillness. Press the keys and see it sparkle. The doll sits still on the dirty floor. Be careful. The sound of planes at night. Speak slowly and tell him no lies. She turned the red kettle on and left it. The water in the town has grown scarce. It's hard now to tell fact from fiction. Neat tricks tire the eyes quite quickly. A big white shark births fresh terror. When the check oil light turns on, the tank is empty. Happy New Year and welcome to the first episode of 2026. I decided to revive something that I used to start these episodes with, the Harvard sentences. If this is the first time you're hearing them, that's what those 10 sentences just were. And because I don't remember which ones I've read and which ones I haven't, I created my own Harvard sentences. I figure, so what if I didn't go to Harvard? Why should that stop me? And in this first episode of the year, I want to talk a bit about AI and social media and my current struggles with these things. Because that's been on my mind a lot lately, actually. But before I do that, I just wanted to mention one quick little thing. The United States, in violation of international law, on January 3rd, invaded Venezuelan airspace, orchestrated a bombing campaign across multiple states from Caracas to Miranda, killing dozens of people and culminating in the abduction of the nation's leader, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife. In a subsequent press conference, Trump said that the U.S. would run the country until they find a suitable replacement, effectively turning Venezuela into a U.S. colony until further notice. And I just want to pause here and say that if any other country invaded a sovereign nation and kidnapped their leader, they'd be condemned as a rogue terrorist state flouting the rules-based order, and they'd be accused of war crimes. In the previous months leading up to this invasion, Trump's administration had been illegally bombing Venezuelan fishing boats, which were alleged to be carrying drugs into the U.S., resulting in the deaths of more than 100 people. And last time I checked, suspicion of drug smuggling wasn't punishable by death under the U.S. Constitution. And it's interesting to me to see the parallels between the invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Venezuela. The sentiment that I'm seeing online and hearing from some folks back home is, yeah, maybe it's not good to just go in and grab somebody up, but the dude was a bad hombre. And this is disturbing because this is the same logic that Trump and his cronies are using to dispatch ICE agents and illegally disappear legal U.S. citizens on American soil and ship them off to torture camps in El Salvador. Effectively, it's lawlessness. It's the abolition of due process. It doesn't matter if the dude is Hitler or Putin or Netanyahu. International law exists for a reason. There's a process in place. We have the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court to deal with disagreements, abuses, and violations of the law. And the US has always had a Wild West sort of frontiersman approach to how it behaves on the world stage. That's not what surprises me here. What surprises me is the lack of international condemnation from the world media outlets. And to clarify, I'm not saying that Maduro wasn't a corrupt authoritarian leader. Maybe he was. But whether he was a piece of shit or not isn't really the point. I'm just saying that the news that we get has a very Western imperialist slant that loves sowing seeds of righteousness for future liberator narratives. And that focusing on whether or not he was a bad ruler for his people is to fall into the same trap of debating whether Venezuelan fishing boats actually were smuggling drugs into the US, or whether Kilmar Abrego Garcia was an MS-13 gang member. It doesn't fucking matter. If you think someone has committed a crime, you charge them with a crime and you bring them into a court of law so justice can be served. Personally, I don't want to live in a world where one sovereign nation can invade another and take over that nation's government to marshal control over their rich oil reserves, rare earth minerals, and other resources with no consequences. Haven't we seen enough of the horrors of Western imperialism? And I just wanted to get that off of my chest here at the beginning because this is a huge current event with far-reaching political implications. Some people are already saying that we are going to see Israel invade Iran, and what the US was doing here was testing the waters. I would say they were testing the waters when they were blowing up ships in international waters.
You like trucks? Big trucks with big wheels, big tires, and a big old red nutsack hanging from the trailer hitch. I know you do. Meet the all-American Dodge Fugitive. Now it's barely legal. You ever dreamed of something greater? Like dream of driving down to the southern border in your brand new Dodge, illegally entering into Mexico, chartering a skiff, and taking to the high seas to gun down a Venezuelan fishing boat in the murky jurisdiction of international waters. I know you do. Dodge Fugitive. Totally American. Totally illegal.
We have yet to see how the dust will settle on all of this. I've seen leaders of the UK coming out and being very hesitant to muster even vague condemnations against the United States at this point, which worries me. But again, I'm not surprised because the UK is just another flavor of Western imperialist power at this point. So I wouldn't expect them to challenge the United States here. I am coming to you from the inside of a cold Volkswagen Transporter, and I wanted to use this to get a little bit warmed up here at the beginning before I dive into AI and social media. I want to note that it is cold. I'm sitting in a long wool jacket with gloves on, a smaller jacket underneath that jacket, a hoodie under that, a hat on, and it's still cold. So I just want to set the tone a bit for where I'm coming to you from here in Poland. And before I get into the technical stuff about AI and social media, I wanted to give you a little bit of information on what led me to this place. Because what I really want to talk about is the kind of dilemma that I'm having right now in relation to social media and artificial intelligence. Because when I make these podcasts, I record them with somebody or I record an episode on my own. I finish the episode and then I make a promotional clip that I put on Instagram. Personally, I don't want to be on social media. I don't want to be in that ecosystem. I don't want to do any sort of self-promotion. It's not what I enjoy. It's not what I like. What I like is to be in front of the microphone, ramble off some thoughts, get present, get confessional, get intimate with the microphone, and just share some time with you and share my thoughts and share a part of myself. And that's what I enjoy. I also enjoy taking a piece of a conversation, one that I feel perhaps exemplifies one of the topics we were exploring, or just a nice soundbite that I think communicates some wisdom or some truth or has some power to it, and dressing that up with a little bit of visual style so that I could play around with storytelling or make some funky music to put to it. And it's just like a little gift that I can give to the guests who graciously donated their time to sit and speak with me. And I always saw it as something like this, where it was my way of putting a nice little vibration out into a social media ecosystem that is largely harmful and toxic from my perspective. So this is what inspired this episode, because I found myself grappling with this and debating whether or not participating in that ecosystem makes me somehow part of the problem, particularly when I'm using AI to do this, because generative AI is harmful to the environment. And I guess that's a good segue into what I want to speak about here, because I didn't know quite how harmful AI was for the environment. And I would bet that many listeners of this show probably have a similar negative perception of AI. Despite having that same perception myself, I still use these tools, and I'm wondering right now whether or not I should continue to. And the answer, I'm beginning to suspect, is no, I shouldn't. So I wanted to share some of those findings with you about AI because I think some of the data points about AI's energy footprint might shock you. They shocked me. And so here we go. I just want to share a handful of these with you. A single ChatGPT query uses 10 times more energy than a Google search. And there's a caveat here, because this calculation was made before Google introduced automatic AI responses to your search queries, which is another insidious thing that I want to talk about, how a lot of existing technologies, like your phone, your Google searches, a lot of the software that you use, has sort of silently thrust AI into your workflow without your consent and opted you in to these things. So now when you do a Google search, you get results that are from AI before you get the actual Google search results. And so what we're talking about in this example is a ChatGPT query as compared to previous Google search, which was just a Google search. Uses 10 times more energy. That's pretty staggering right there. And now thinking about the data centers that house all the servers where this computing is happening, a mid-sized data center consumes about 300,000 gallons of water a day, or about as much as 1,000 US households. And this is research out of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. They estimate that their direct on-site consumption ranks data centers among the top 10 water users in America's industrial and commercial sectors. So it's already significant, right? And AI is scaling up. Google's data centers in the Dalles, I don't know, it's a town in Oregon. It consumes more than a quarter of all of the water used in that city. So that's just a preview into the enormous amounts of water that AI is using at the moment. And we've spoken about text queries, but what about generating images? What about going on Midjourney or using Stable Diffusion or any of these generative AI art websites? Generating one image costs about 50% of a smartphone battery in terms of energy. And that is wild. And anyone who's used these tools, as you know, you don't just generate one image. Usually you're generating a batch of 4 images. And of those images, maybe you don't get a good one, so you roll the dice again. So maybe you've generated 8 images to get one usable one. So it's a very iterative, wasteful process. Most of the results are poor, so you really have to mine through a lot of garbage to find something usable. And so we've established that image generation is worse than text, but video is worse than image, which makes sense. And it gets more complex because there are huge variations even within the text prompts. So a simple, straightforward text prompt that a model doesn't really have to struggle for isn't going to be as energy intensive as a more complex text prompt where the model has to think and perform analysis, which can produce 50 times the carbon emissions of a simple, straightforward prompt. So there's a lot of variety here, and it depends on the complexity, but it's just to show that there are considerable energy concerns when just using text prompts. And a lot of people aren't using just text prompts. A lot of people are using image prompts. They're using combinations of images and text prompts. And more recently, we've seen an explosion, a complete proliferation of video content. And that's where things start to get more worrying, because every Sora 2 video, and these are videos that last less than 10 seconds, burns 1 kilowatt hour of energy, 4 liters of water, and emits 455 grams of carbon. So just to help you wrap your head around that for a second, what does that mean? For reference, 1 kilowatt hour of power is equivalent to running a desktop computer for about 6.5 hours, or leaving an LED light bulb on for 83 hours, or running a vacuum for an hour, or turning on the microwave for 67 minutes. So this is huge to generate a short video. And as I said, most of the time people are generating this content in batches. So multiply that by 4. And then, like I said, they might be re-rolling that 2 or 3 times to get a usable video. And what we're talking about right now is just usage, right? So when it comes to training these AI models like ChatGPT-3, that produces 626,000 pounds of carbon dioxide. 626,000. And you might say, okay, sounds like a lot, but can you help me wrap my head around that? What does that look like exactly? That would be equivalent to 300 round-trip flights from New York to San Francisco. So from coast to coast of the North American continent, 300 times. This is enormous amounts of energy. This was surprising to me. I didn't realize that it was quite that energy intensive. And if all of that wasn't problematic enough, by next year, in 2027, AI is projected to make up 30% of cloud system demand, up from 14% in 2025. So it's doubling. And nearly 90% of organizations, including traditional enterprises, Global 2000 companies, and sectors like telecom, retail, education, government, banking, all plan to increase cloud spending. So by 2030, in 4 short years, data centers are predicted to emit triple the amount of CO2 annually as compared to pre-AI levels. This equates to roughly 40% of the US current annual emissions. By the end of 2025 alone, AI had surpassed the energy demand of countries like the Netherlands, Finland, Austria, Switzerland, and Ireland. So AI is already using more energy than entire countries. And despite the mounting evidence of generative AI's negative environmental impacts, 1 in 4 businesses have integrated generative AI into their processes as of 2024. And the number is rising all the time. But only 12% of executives using AI or measuring the environmental impact. Which leads me to the largest and most horrifying takeaway here, which is that we don't have clear numbers. Think about that. We don't have clear numbers on the emissions from the companies that are pioneering AI. Researchers estimate that companies like Meta, for example, could be dealing with numbers that are up to 600% higher than what's being reported due to creative accounting and fudging the numbers to diminish the true demands. This would be the equivalent of big tobacco companies concealing the health risks of smoking, or of oil companies hiding the harrowing environmental findings by scientists back in the 60s and 70s. And so this is the position we're in right now. These data centers are going to continue to scale, and they're buying up farmland in states like Virginia, Ohio, Texas, Oregon, Iowa, where they're altering the landscapes and the ecosystems there to build these super energy intensive and water intensive structures. And this is happening in Kenya as well, in China, and often in less affluent regions threatened by water insecurity. So that's the kind of landscape that we're in right now with AI. These are the kind of specific numbers and figures that I didn't know about. I just knew, yeah, AI was bad for the environment. I know it uses a lot of energy and a lot of water and produces a lot of e-waste. But I didn't know quite how energy intensive it was and what the rate of scale is and how pervasive these tools are becoming in existing sectors. Like I was mentioning before, banking, telecom, retail, education, government. So it's spreading like wildfire. And as it does, its energy demands will increase by orders of magnitude. And the question that keeps circling in my head is it worth it? Because the way these tools are currently being used, for the most part, is for entertainment, is for viral marketing. It's not really producing things that are of artistic merit. It seems kind of soulless and hollow. It seems like, they call it slop for a reason. A lot of the AI that I see online, I would argue, shouldn't have even been made. It brings nothing. Maybe that's judgmental on my part to say that, but to me, it's kind of drivel. It's not making any important point. There's no political commentary. There's no satire. There's no subversion. There's no soul. There's no passion. It's all spectacle with no substance. But I digress. So let me get us back on topic here and talk about the next company on the list. So I've spoken about AI, I've spoken about Meta, and now I want to talk about Spotify, because this is another huge point of tension with me, because I release this podcast out on Spotify. They are hosting my podcast. That's where most of my listeners are. Sure, I push this podcast out to YouTube. It's on Apple Podcasts. But between those three places, Spotify, I think, is the place where most people find podcasts. And the problem is that the business models for companies like Spotify are not only exploitative in terms of how they treat artists or their employees, paying artists pennies and preventing their workers from unionizing, but in the case of Spotify, they actually embrace and actively empower the military-industrial complex. In the latter half of 2025, Spotify CEO Daniel Ek invested $600 million into a company called Helsing. It's a German tech company developing AI defense systems for drones and weapons. And more recently, Spotify faced backlash for pushing recruiting advertisements from ICE. And then they refused to pull the ads after pressure from artists and subscribers. So, is this the kind of company that I want to be supporting? Is that what I want to be a part of? Do I want to be in that ecosystem? Those are all things that I am categorically against. Militarism, exploitation, union busting. It's disgusting. right? And then there's the social media platforms like Instagram and Twitter that I mentioned before, where if you're a content creator, anyone who's creating content or consuming digital media is doing it on social media. And I'm not sure I need to say much about Twitter, which has become a complete and utter cesspool under Elon Musk's leadership. It's full of hateful rhetoric, lies, and misinformation, which are often perpetuated by Musk himself. But Instagram is where I have my podcast. That's where I put out my clips. And that's a Meta company. And as we know, they've been making a fortune from harvesting and selling our user data. There's been scandals about their failures to implement adequate child safety protocols. There's been widespread mistaken account bans and shadow bans, and Zuckerberg's recent decision to end fact-checking on the platform. Human Rights Watch has accused Meta of systemic bias and censoring of pro-Palestinian content on its platform. Meta even recently revised its hate speech guidelines to be more lax and more permissive. In October, a couple of months ago, they were found to be in breach of EU laws around the Digital Services Act due to ineffective and confusing mechanisms for users to flag harmful content. They were accused of using designs called dark patterns to make it more difficult for users to perform simple content moderation tasks. And that's something that's worth mentioning here, because dark patterns, people might not know what that means. A dark pattern would be something where, you know how when you're online and something pops up on your phone, typically the yes and the no button are almost always in the same spot. And some applications will flip them so that you've been habituated by countless apps, countless times saying yes or no, accept, reject. And occasionally they'll flip it the other way and you'll accidentally hit the wrong button. So this would be an example of a dark pattern, that it's kind of confusing, it's misleading, it might cause a user to do something else because it deviates from the accepted standard. Another way that people embrace dark patterns is they might hide opt-out buttons behind a complex labyrinth of menus, where it feels like you're on a fucking scavenger hunt, digging through different menus and submenus, trying to opt out. And maybe you finally find the place to opt out, and it has a link which takes you out of the app into a website where you have to write an email and provide some information about your user ID or account number. So they make it very cumbersome and difficult for you to perform a basic task, which would be to opt out of data collection, for instance, or to limit privacy settings so that you have more granular control over what information this app is keeping on you. So that's a bit about dark patterns for anyone who may have been wondering what a dark pattern is. And so for the sake of argument, let's just say we forget about all this legal stuff. And we forget about the environmental harms, the e-waste, the energy, the water consumption, the growing number of data centers that will exacerbate all of these concerns. I'd argue that on a mental health level, these applications are doing untold harm to us. And before you say, well, you're just some anti-tech Luddite hippie who lives in a van and farms and hangs out in the middle of nowhere somewhere in Europe, why the fuck should I listen to you about any of this? And that's a good question. But the answer is that I used to work for these companies. I used to work in Silicon Valley. I worked at Apple. I worked at Twitter. This isn't some alien world that I'm just making uninformed, hasty, baseless speculations about. This is the world that I left. And I left it for a reason. So just humor me a bit here. I think it's uncontroversial to say that social media erodes our attention span. It impairs deep critical thinking in favor of surface level processing over legitimate analysis. I think a convincing argument could be made that the more advanced a people's technology becomes, the more it infantilizes them. At the same time as the tool empowers us, it disempowers us. and it makes us more reliant on the tool, outsourcing our sovereignty and autonomy to an external locus instead of an internal one. And it's already happening with the invention of cell phones, Google Maps, calculators. Do you remember when you remembered all of your friends' phone numbers? Do you remember when you knew how to get somewhere without using Google Maps? Do you remember basic arithmetic? I was speaking to a friend recently who still works in tech, and he was telling me how he sees colleagues who are just pasting AI-generated code into pull requests, and how even he, now that he's interviewing for a new role, has noticed his skills have diminished and atrophied from using AI too much. I saw a great quote the other day that said, AI makes it so that technical competence can be simulated rather than possessed. And this really encapsulates the heart of what I think one of the central dangers of AI is. And I bet as an educator, AI is posing similar challenges in universities. And think about that for a second, because in a few years, we're going to have doctors treating us, mental health workers prescribing mind-altering medications, software engineers coding our autonomous vehicles, and engineers building our bridges who are using AI to help them get grades that they might not have earned. And yeah, of course, cheating and academic deception have existed since schools have existed. But now the ease of use and the barrier to entry is so low that unless we adopt widespread reform and overhaul the way that we test and evaluate human knowledge and competencies, we are in for a whole new world of surprise and and a whole assortment of unpleasantries, I would bet. I want to know that my doctors, my engineers, whether it's software or physical engineers, I want to know that my health professionals, I want to know that people who I trust, who should be qualified, are actually qualified. And for the first time, we're going to see a whole cohort of people where that may not be the case for. They may be less qualified than previous generations. And so we see the effects up and down the chain here, right? Automation isn't just going to affect factory workers and people who perform very mechanical, monotonous, repetitive skills, but we're seeing it in the professional sector as well, like my friend who works for a tech company. We're seeing engineers resorting to cheap solutions, hacky, half-assed fixes from AI. And I hope that I'm showing you that these are some basic negative cognitive impacts with real-world implications. But if we pull back further and we look at the bigger picture, and we go back to social media, what is social media doing? What is social media? Social media is an attention economy. The longer TikTok or Instagram or Twitter can keep your eyes glued to the screen, the more engagement their content gets, the more money their advertisers are willing to pay them. I wonder if you've noticed this new feature on Instagram where they force ad breaks into your scrolling. Have you seen that? I'm not talking about the ads that you see when you scroll your timeline. I'm talking about not being able to scroll your timeline because an ad is being forced onto the screen for 5 seconds. So it prevents you from scrolling again. It's like the equivalent of a YouTube commercial. If we know we're in an attention economy, what are the implications of that? There's a great quote from legendary musician Brian Eno talking about social media where he says, "If it had started out in a not-for-profit regime, it would have been different, because maximize engagement wouldn't have been the headline of the whole project. Maximizing engagement is just another word for maximize profit. And if that's your intention, then you get what we got. Just like in the American food industry is maximize profit, which is why you have a lot of very, very unhealthy people." And there's a great media theorist named Marshall McLuhan. Famously, he said that the medium is the message. meaning that the form and structure of a communications medium will inform the shape of a given media format's content. So radio is different than TV, is different from the internet, is different than social media. Well, then, if the medium is the message, I'd say that the economic model of the platform is what's writing the check. And let me explain. If the apps want our eyes on the screen, the algorithms will uncover what is most statistically likely to keep them there. The algorithm, in this case, is just observing patterns over time and reporting back. And it turns out that the patterns that get the most traction are sex, outrage, fear, and cute kittens. And so these items get pushed to the top of your feed by the algorithm because it thinks that that's what you want to see. So the shape of the content we consume takes on a very visual, fast, popcorn, potato chip kind of consistency where we just keep mindlessly munching as long as we can reach our hand into the bag and there are more chips. Bite-sized, quick, crunchy, salty, barbecue-flavored rewards proliferate in this economy. Not healthy, nutritional meals that provoke analytical thinking and reflection. And then in time, the economy becomes self-reinforcing so that now all of the content that's being created, if it wants to go viral, needs to assume the proper shape and posture. And the whole social media landscape becomes performative and hollow, and influencer culture prevails as scantily clad models bend over in their new tawdry fast fashion, sponsored by Fashion Nova, of course. And people with millions of followers sell themselves to the highest bidder to sell you new energy drinks, new vape products, or biohacking supplements. That's a scary place. And this in turn tells us as consumers that if we want to fit in there, we should buy these things. We should have perfect lives, luxury items, lots of followers, and beautiful AI augmented bodies. We are sliding into a twisted world of trans beauty standards. And don't take that soundbite out of context. I'm talking about trans real here. And that, I think, is the new frontier now. The crossroads where AI and social media converge. This combination has already corroded our ability to discern fact from fiction and real from make-believe. We've partially crossed the threshold of the uncanny valley where AI is good enough now to fool people. I see fake accounts of sexy AI streamer girls or influencer models with hundreds of thousands of followers and thirsty gooners in the comments, telling these non-existent women how beautiful they are, how much they love them.
Please DM me back, baby. My pee-pee so hard for you right now. Kissy face. Eggplant. Squirt.
And as an aside, I don't think AI is going to become sentient and take over the world and eradicate the human race. I don't think that that's realistically on the table. I do think that real harm is happening here and now, and I don't need to imagine some dystopian horror show. What I just described is horror enough. The risks of AI are already realized and tangible. We don't need to imagine some distant dystopian future to see the real-world impacts of AI on misinformation, education, jobs, politics, human cognition, and our environment. I've just spent the whole podcast speaking about these things. Those are all already here, now, today. And when we reach down deeper into those implications, not only can't we tell what's real, but news organizations who are responsible for verifying sources and uncovering the truth, they are going to have the same problems. I remember towards the end of 2025, I was already seeing fake ICE arrests or fake Sora 2 videos of African Americans whose SNAP benefits were being eliminated. And the insidious thing here is that these videos undermine the very real and legitimate claims of ICE abuse and food insecurity. But they give the administration and other media sources the ability to argue that these abuses are overblown or illegitimate. So it's pretty chilling how a regime or an administration or a certain ideology can now craft story, realistic story, compelling story, and have these proliferate out through social media. Imagine if an Israeli AI startup started manufacturing realistic videos of Palestinians suicide bombing IDF soldiers or using children as human shields to justify a radical escalation in violence on behalf of Netanyahu's regime. This isn't far-fetched at all, right? And this is where provenance and content credentials come in. And some of you may have never heard of these terms before, but provenance in this case means the place of origin of something. You could think of it as a kind of watermarking system to come in and help distinguish real from synthetic. And there's a need for a robust auditing and certification ecosystem as we move into this world where we can no longer discern what's real and what's fake. And there are smart people working on this. There are organizations working night and day to figure out how we can do this. There's a Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, or C2PA, who provide open technical standards for publishers, creators, and consumers to establish the origin and edits of digital content. So these kind of content credentials ensures content complies with standards as the digital ecosystem evolves. You could think of this as something similar to like EXIF data when you take a photograph. It'll take the time and place, it'll get a geolocation, maybe the shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO. All of this stuff goes into the data that's generated when you take an image. But then you could think about some cases where you may not want that data to be present. You may not want to know what time and where and with what device an image or a video was captured, right? Let's say you're a government whistleblower. You want to report some kind of abuse. Maybe someone's civil rights are being violated. Maybe there are war crimes happening. And now, if you take a video and you wipe the content credentials from it or you clear the EXIF data, is that data inadmissible in court? So things get tricky. Things get weird and confusing. And I don't know what the answer is here. But I do think one big issue here is that we are much more prone to believe what we see and hear. The enchanting nature of light and sound and movement tend to mystify us. And often, I think once we see something, we don't care so much about the content credentials of a given piece of media. Once we see a thing and it goes viral, it doesn't matter so much whether it's fake or not because the damage has already been done. The spell has been cast. The meme has been injected into the collective consciousness. It's gone viral, right? It's like those obviously fake UFO and Bigfoot videos that you'd see online way before AI. People who already believed in aliens and Bigfoot used them as proof, even though they were laughably fake. Demonstrably so, often. So you don't need the video to be real. You just need the people who want it to be. And that's chilling. And so this is all the stuff that's been swirling in my head, right? I am at an ethical crossroads with hosting my podcast on Spotify, knowing all of this. I have a moral dilemma continuing to use Instagram, knowing all of this, knowing about Meta. I am grappling with the question of whether or not it is possible to responsibly use generative AI tools like Midjourney or Sora 2 to generate images or videos that can bring something good into that ecosystem. And I don't know what the answer is, and I don't think I'm going to arrive at one in this episode, but I will say that it's something that is taking up a lot of my mental processing these days. I want it to be true that I can create something of value that could give someone a window into a world that they hadn't previously seen. They see a short 1 or 2 minute video about kinship or about what's happening in Gaza or about animism or about myth and story or any of the things that I talk about on this podcast. And maybe this reaches someone who it wouldn't have reached otherwise. Is reaching that additional person worth the environmental cost, worth the water usage, the energy usage? And I don't know what the answer is. Can art be made that works against these systems, that works at unraveling them, that subverts them, that undermines them? Maybe. Maybe the answer is even probably. But is it worth the cost? Do the ends justify the means here? And I think maybe many content creators are grappling with this right now because I've spoken to other people who share similar concerns. You know, often as a content creator, you might be spending hours or a day or 2 days working on something, recording the audio, making a song, doing a visual edit, getting everything just right. And you send it out and it reaches 50 people, it reaches 100 people. No one engages with it. It's like you just sent it out into the void. You built an elaborate little paper boat, put it into the stream and the gutter, and it just sailed right into the fucking drain. You know, was it worth the energy and time you spent on it? Was it worth the love and heart and passion? Did it reach anyone? Did it make a difference? And because it didn't, is that reason enough not to do it again? Because I've had situations where I've made something and it's reached 10,000 people. I've made something and it's reached 5,000 people. It's reached 7,000 people. You know, reaching thousands of people with an idea is great. That's a powerful thing, and it can make a difference in people's lives. So I don't know what the answer is here, but part of me feels like if it requires so much energy, so much water, and those demands are only going to go up, do I want to be contributing to that? Is that another toxic, sick, unhealthy ecosystem that I want to be a part of? I feel like the answer is no. On a spiritual level, from somewhere in my soul, I feel like the answer to that question is no. But it's not so simple, right? Because if I pull this podcast off of Spotify, and now I'm reaching less than half of the number of people, what impact is this having? If I make static image clips with a little quote on it and no one interacts with it, who am I reaching? And so this is the dilemma. This is where I am right now. And I wanted to just share that so people know that this is a real burning question in me. And some days I'm decided to just pull everything off of Spotify and go somewhere else. But then I think, where would I even go? Whose hands are clean in this system, in this world that we live in, right? What does it mean to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society? I think Krishnamurti said something like that. Is there anywhere else to go? Are there better places? Maybe we shouldn't think about it in terms of absolutes. Maybe the idea is reducing harm, mitigating harm. So if you don't use Spotify, use someone who pays their artists more money and doesn't interfere with their employees unionizing, and it's already a win. Maybe. It gets tricky, right? Because I was at a talk last summer, and there was a guy who was talking about environmentalism and eco-psychology, and he encouraged everybody to put, I think he's actually a pretty famous guy in Poland. His name is Richard Kulik, something like that. And he developed some kind of carbon footprint calculator, and he invited everybody to put in their data and see what their carbon footprint was and what they could do to reduce it. And he was telling a story how he faced a similar conundrum where he was invited to give a talk somewhere in Portugal about these very things. And for him to go to do this talk in Portugal would require him to fly or to spend days going by bus, car, and train to go do a talk for 2 days and come all the way back. So the ecological expenditure that he'd need to make to invest in that would be considerable. And would it be worth it? Would him being there at that conference, talking about these things, reach and impact enough people in a positive enough way that would merit or justify the travel? And he was saying the same thing, that he didn't know what to do. And this is something that's hard. I've seen there's a guest who I hope to have on sometime in the coming months. She's an indigenous woman. She's a musician. She is a scholar. She is a indigenous food sovereignty specialist. She is a lot of things. And she was recently speaking about this, about flying. And she flies a lot to give talks. She goes to Europe sometimes. She goes all over the world. And she feels this same tension where it's like, when I fly to go give this talk, is this against my values? Am I doing more harm than good right now? Is it justified that I'm taking this flight if what I'm doing it for is in the interests of helping people and helping the world and stopping these kind of things? She still flies, and this Polish eco-psychologist still went to do the talk. But I don't think for either of them it's an easy decision. And for me, this isn't easy either. And so I want to share this tension because maybe others are having it too. Maybe it's helpful to somebody. Maybe most of us would agree that our technologies reflect our collective stories. And I'd say that that's probably especially true for technologies like AI. And if AI is learning from the collective data pool of all of human knowledge and information, it becomes a kind of like digital egregore. And this is a concept from Western esotericism of a non-physical entity or a thought form that can arise from the collective thoughts and emotions of a group of individuals. So then, does AI become this digital egregore, which is like an animate force born from our human attention and our energy and our history? And if so, if these networks and models are trained on data sets built on competition, fear, extraction, aren't we coding those very biases into AI? Like, it seems AI may become a mirror haunted by our own unresolved griefs and failures, like a ghost coded out of everything we refuse to feel. The ghost in the machine is all of our most twisted and wicked qualities. And if that's true, if there's truth in that, doesn't it make sense then to try to inject other stories into that system? Stories of hope, stories of connection, stories of kinship, animism, love. Maybe. Or how else do things change? I don't know. I don't fucking know. And I'm not going to pretend to know. I don't know if anybody knows. But as I end here, because my feet are completely fucking numb, I can't feel my toes anymore, I just want to share a concluding thought. I'm thinking how anthropologically people across all time and place have feared possession by spirits. It's everywhere in the sociological and anthropological record. And it's interesting because today We don't even need to believe in ghosts and spirits. We are being possessed by algorithms, not supernaturally, but psychologically, neurologically, culturally. This is happening. In Vanessa Andreotti's newest book, Outgrowing Modernity, you've heard me talk about this book many times. She speaks about the concept of algorithmic conditioning or algorithmic modernity. And so I want to share with this very relevant quote here. She says, algorithmic modernity doesn't just control resources or power structures. It shapes attention itself. Algorithms are designed to harvest and monetize our focus, manipulating our neurobiology to seek rewards through the release of dopamine and oxytocin, the brain chemicals associated with pleasure and social bonding. This system feeds on our desire for validation, creating a feedback loop where our attention becomes a commodity, bought and sold in the marketplace of data. The result is not just an individual impact, but a reshaping of collective realities and social values. So if she's right, and I think she is, these structures, social media, AI, they are actively reshaping human values around knowledge production and consumption. And we don't know how these things will pan out because we haven't seen a technology quite like this before. I don't have any of the answers here. But we are in truly strange times. We are already in a sort of dystopian future. We don't need to imagine it. We are in times of collapse and unraveling. We are in times of empire and imperialism and war and genocide and cruelty and greed. All of these things are here. But at the same time, in all of that rot and decay and collapse and pain, there is the seed of something else. Something else is blooming. Something beautiful, something maybe previously impossible, something that requires imagination and mystery. And that's exciting. That's powerful. I don't know. But I can't feel my feet anymore. So I'm going to go. Thanks for listening. As always, be good to one another, to all of the human and non-human persons out there. I will catch you next time. And if you're enjoying this show, I would invite you to not just share it with friends, but of course, you're free to do that. I would invite you to comment where you listen to podcasts, whether that's on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcasts or somewhere else. Share your thoughts, ask a question, connect somehow. I'm curious to hear your ideas, your questions, your thoughts, how you feel about these types of things. So reach out, and I will talk to you next time.